So you are what you are in this world. That's either one or two things. Either you're somebody, or you ain't nobody.
I want what you got, Uncle Frank. I want to be you.
My investigation indicates that Frank Lucas is above the mafia.
Who does he work for? Which family?
He's not Italian, he's black.
No black man has accomplished what the American mafia hasn't in 100 years.
They tried to kill my wife.
Frank Lucas is the most dangerous man walking the streets of our city.
This is my home. Frank Lucas don't run from nobody. This is America.
How's it going, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Underrated Series. I'm your host, Steve Cravens, and joining me once again, Terrence Tatum. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
And today we're talking about Ridley Scott's American Gangster, which was released on November 2nd of 2007. 2007 was actually a pretty strong year for movies if you go back and look at it. And in my opinion, I know you share the same opinion, this is one of the stronger entries of the entire year. You look at No Country for Old Men, you look at There Will Be Blood, you look at, Juno, you look at Zodiac. The Bourne Ultimatum, a lot of, even, if you like George Clooney and his films, you got Michael Clayton. I mean, there was a lot of
Clooney fan, yeah.
And then if you like the summer blockbusters, I mean, my God, we had the first Transformers, which spawned an entire, it was just 300. It was a wild, wild year that doesn't get enough credit, in my opinion. It's not 1999, but it was a great year. American Gangster is one of those films that, despite being loved by fans of the genre, despite being loved by the critics, if you look at Rotten Tomatoes, it's fresh. If you look at IMDb, I believe it's got a 7.8 rating right now. And yet, it is underrated in terms of the crime film genre. Because if you think about it, when you talk to people about the movie, Terrence, when you're talking about the crime genre as a whole, Let's face it, the movies that we probably think about first are probably like, we talk about The Godfather, Godfather Part 2, we probably talk about Heat, Departed, movies like that.
Scarface, those type of movies get put up first. Yeah.
For sure. Collateral even. I think you hear Collateral mentioned more often than American Gangster.
For crime stories, yeah.
But American Gangster, it's one of those movies that for some reason, I just don't know why, despite people liking this movie, it is criminally underrated in its own genre. I don't understand it because the acting is great across the board. The writing's
top notch. Yeah.
I just don't understand. So let's dive into the movie and kind of get into the nitty gritty of why we love it, the strengths of it, and also I have some things about maybe some cons about it that we could talk about because I do think there are some faults with the movie that maybe turn some people off and actually prevents them from embracing it as much as I think they should. So let's go ahead and start off with a little bit of the backstory behind the movie, and I'll get your take on this as well. Originally, when it was first kind of pitched to Hollywood, if you will, Nicholas Pileggi, who was the author of Wise Guy, which eventually he co-wrote into Goodfellas with Martin Scorsese, and then 5 years later, Casino as well, he brought it to the attention of Hollywood. He brought the article to the attention, which I believe was titled The Return of Superfly. He brought it to the attention of Hollywood, and it was originally going to be called True Blue. And they were looking at Brian De Palma to direct, and why not? Because he made Scarface and along with some other crime movies, The Untouchables.
He fits. Yeah.
He fits. Oliver Stone, who I think would have been great because Oliver Stone actually says that he wrote Scarface, but he wishes more than anything that he was an established director when he did write it, so he could have directed it himself. And ultimately, it's a subject matter that I don't think he's ever really touched in terms of the gangster picture. He's done crime films, but not a true gangster movie.
Yeah, so he'll have violence in crime films, but it never really gets into the gangsters, Italian, like none of that really happens in any of his films. Yeah.
It's touched on in JFK that the mafia was involved, but he didn't do a straight up gangster.
Correct.
And then, interestingly enough, in 2004, Antoine Fuqua was all set to direct it with Denzel in the lead, and then Benicio del Toro in the Russell Crowe role. James Gandolfini was casting it in Josh Brolin's role. So they had the cast that was going, and I guess that Fuqua and Universal, Fuqua was pushing for $100 million plus budget, and Universal was kind of saying, no, let's pare it down a little bit, and they just couldn't see eye to eye on where the budget should come in, and ultimately it fell apart in 2004. And then Universal decided, well, if we can't do this version, let's go with an ultra cheap version. They got rid of Denzel and his $20 million salary, and they brought in Don Cheadle, who's an excellent actor.
Fantastic actor, yeah.
Some would say just as compelling as Denzel.
I would say there might be more charisma on day-to-day from Denzel, but I think the range that Don gives from role to role is vastly different. I think you won't say you know what you're expecting from Don Cheadle from time to time, where I feel like Denzel, you kind of know what you're getting. It's not bad, but you know what you're getting from Denzel. It's a very pretty much straight, but there's just man oozes charisma. So yeah, they do different things on the spectrum, but it's you can go either way, and you got a good flip.
Either way, frankly, I think I know Don Cheadle may not be the household name that Denzel is.
Yes, especially then.
Yes, that is key right there, especially then. And then in 2006, Brian Grazer was able to convince Ridley Scott to take it on. And Steven Zaillian, who actually wrote the screenplay for Antoine Fuqua in 2004, was paid to basically do a rewrite of his entire script, which as far as I know, what he did was he basically got paid again to just write the same script twice, which good for you. But anyway, so they got Ridley Scott. Steven Zaillian rewrites the script. And that was enough to get Denzel back on board. And at this point, Ridley Scott and Russell Crowe have a pretty good working relationship. At this point, they've done 2 movies together.
Yeah.
This was number 3. And from then on, the cast is filled out. And this is what I love the most. It kind of sucks for Fuqua. I actually met Fuqua back in February 2010 when he was promoting Brooklyn's Finest in Chicago. And I actually did get to ask him, and he was very political about it. I said, just out of curiosity, how would your film have been different from Ridley Scott's and whatnot? And he said, well, stylistically, obviously, it would have been different. The cast would have been different. The thing that kind of irked him about it was the fact that he was fighting for a bigger budget. And he never got it in 2004. 3 years later, I guess, they were comfortable giving Ridley Scott the $100 million because he was able to get Russell Crowe in over Benicio del Toro.
Which is a bigger name that they thought.
It's a bigger name.
Building the two of them, which, it did work. We put the two of them on a poster and you got an instant sell off rip.
You've essentially got you know what? This might be controversial. I'm saying that maybe just a shade under or equal to Al Pacino and Robert De Niro in Heat.
It's pretty close.
In terms of acting talent, it's right. Yeah, they're right there. Right there.
Yeah.
So Fuqua kind of expressed a little bit of frustration that Ridley Scott was able to get it in, and he wasn't. But ultimately, Benicio del Toro, being the great actor that he is, unfortunately doesn't have.
I think it's a twofold thing too. To not get too political, I also feel Antoine probably was like, it's easier for Ridley to get that 100, 150. One being a name, but also not being a black director versus Antoine being a black director at that time. That's a part of it too.
It is true, and I also had to think about if Ridley, let's say this project came about in 1999, I seriously doubt that Ridley Scott would have gotten the okay to do it because he was on a major slump.
He was down
in the late 90s. He was in a huge slump. And Gladiator really revitalized his career. That was a huge renaissance for him because he was he had Thelma and Louise in 1991. Huge hit, best director nomination, all that's great. 1492 right after it, huge flop. And then he did White Squall 4 years later, which was another flop.
Yeah, Jane. Yeah.
Tony Scott was doing much better than he was in the 90s. Tony Scott was killing it, and Ridley wasn't. Yeah. So he was lucky because, Gladiator, then Hannibal, Black Hawk Down. So he was putting together.
And I love, even though it's very different, I love Matchstick Men too. So
Yeah.
So he was back into a groove with that.
He had rebounded. So his stock had risen. Whereas, frankly, Antoine Fuqua in 2004, if you remember, up to that point, I think he had Bait, The Replacement Killers, Training Day in 2001, and then he did Tears of the Sun in 2003. And then in 2004, when he was gearing up, the studio butchered King Arthur from him.
Yeah.
So it sucks because, Fuqua's always been one of those directors who's always been very solid.
I never really think that, for me, I've never really think that Antoine is ever a home run. I never think he knocks it out, but it is always like that, a three base, oh yeah, you got to that third base. You're quite there. And I think some of it is because it's hard because he's attached himself to a guy who is very charismatic in Denzel. And so a lot of his films, you're I don't know if The Equalizer or if Training Day would be as good because the directing doesn't seem that good, but that character, Denzel, is killing it. And he's sort of made that feel higher than I probably would have without Denzel in that part.
I agree with you, actually. I agree with you. And I don't want to call him a hacker or workmanlike or anything like that.
We'll never do that because Olympus is fault. Like, I think they're good projects and they're good films, but they don't ever feel like there's never that thing that sort of separates him from and it's like a step up from the every meal type of director. Like, he's there, like he shouldn't be put with them, and I want him to continue getting work. But I feel like a lot of his is attached to you put great talent in front of it. Like Southpaw, even with Jake Gyllenhaal, I was like, that movie's not good, but Jake is killing it in this movie.
It's an interesting point. It's a very interesting point.
Yeah.
It's sort of one I'd like to talk about in another video about him, if we ever do a video just talking about Fuqua movies. But anyway, so Ridley Scott, they're off and running, and one of the reasons why the budget was so high is because Universal actually wanted him to shoot the movie in Toronto. And with period pieces, that's going to be very expensive because you got to clear the streets, you got to
move, yeah,
everything, the period cars and the costumes, everything. But he held his ground and said, "No, this is a New York story. We're filming this in New York. Period. End of story. That's where we're filming it. And if that's how we're not going to do it, then I don't even want to make a movie." They got to do it that way. So let's kind of dive right into it. A big, and you were talking about this with Fuqua and Denzel. Let's talk about this right out of the gate. Denzel makes every movie he's in better. It doesn't matter who's directing it. Doesn't matter who's writing it. Doesn't matter who's co-starring. He makes every film better just because he is that charismatic. He is that great of an actor. Now, obviously, he's got a hell of a supporting cast behind him in this movie.
This cast is stacked. Especially watching it in retrospect, because at that time, some of these actors that are in here were not that big. But if you go back and watch it, you're like, wait, Idris Elba's just a side. What is happening?
Josh
side characters? Yeah.
He's got a hell of a killer cast, but at the end of the day, this movie, it lives and dies by Denzel's ferocity, his absolutely brilliant. Charisma, I think, isn't even a strong enough word to describe the power and magnetism that he has when he's up on the screen. Mm-hmm. So let me go ahead and ask you this: when you watch this movie, when you're thinking about the cast, when you're thinking about the characters, and if you want to start with Denzel, you can. Where do they rank for you in the all-time great crime characters? Because obviously this is a true story. Frank Lucas did exist. Richie Roberts did exist. I guess what I'm trying to get at here is, did they do a good enough job of making these characters three-dimensional and making them complex, in the sense that you don't necessarily root for anyone in particular, you just kind of observe them? Does that make sense?
It does. It does. It's hard. That's where I think this movie has a bit of a hard time, because Denzel is so good and is so charismatic. You almost, and you shouldn't, but Frank comes off really, really good in this. Like the audience and the neighborhood, because he was like the black. He was bumpy. Also gave back to the community a lot. So I think Frank also, that's just how he was. Like, yeah, he was a terrible man. He killed tons of people. He infected his community with heroin. But the majority of those folks loved him. And I think that's sort of what the audience does too. Like, and some of that is because Denzel is just lovable, even as a bad person. Even with Training Day, you're not supposed to like that character, but at the end of the day, you're like, but he is pretty killing. He's pretty amazing to watch. And I think that's sort of where some of the issues, why this film has a hard time, is because there really isn't a true, like Frank is the villain of this, but there really isn't one. And so you're watching a crime story where they're all sort of mirror images of each other, which is kind of the point. And that's why I dig it, because while Richie is the cop, he has a lot of demons in his personal life, whereas vice versa, where Frank is doing a lot of things terrible for the community, but his personal life, for the most part, is pretty on the up and up. He has some issues with his family, but on the most part, that's where he's going. And so I think a lot of times, for me, I know, especially in the Black community, the biggest thing with gangsters and gang films and all those is the whole quote unquote clause of don't snitch. And I think a lot of times this film sort of gets like, oh, we love that performance. Frank is amazing, but he snitched. And so a lot of people kind of just like, I can't really get behind. I can't really back him that much.
You know what? All right. So I'm glad we're getting into this now, because I did want to talk about this. And I think that is kind of a reason we're talking about the charisma of Denzel. I think that his charisma actually did the character disservice because in the sense that from what I understand from watching behind the scenes documentaries and reading articles about Frank Lucas, he was incredibly charismatic. That's how he was able to get a lot of stuff done.
Right.
That's how
especially as a black man at that time, you have to be. There has to be. Yeah.
So that's not the problem here. My problem here is that you're not in terms of the movie. You should be making sure that the audience wants to go on this journey, but don't root for this guy. And the script does the script kind of by default kind of makes you root for him in the sense that they go out of their way when Bumpy dies to show you that, oh God, I can't remember Idris Elba's character's name.
Tango. Tango, yeah.
So Tango kind of looks down upon him and kind of treats him like dirt, hey, even with the funeral scene or the wake scene or whatever it was.
Yeah, when he puts the coaster under and he's like, oh, cool, go get me some.
Go get me a light while you're at
it. Yeah.
Appreciate it, whatever. And then he kind of bullies him some more and puts pressure on him some more in the restaurant scene where he's kind of, squeezing for 20% of whatever he's making and all that other stuff. And, and then you see, him going up against the crooked cops, for example, going up against Trupo and guys like that. So it kind of puts him in, I don't want to say hero's life, but certainly into
he's put into situations that a hero or the protagonist of a film would be put in. And it's hard for you to separate that, because even in the scenes when Trupo takes the drugs from him, in that moment, you're like, oh man, they just did him dirty. He's screwed. And in that scene, he still gets in his car. He's like, his brother, played by amazingly by Chiwetel, is like, yeah. I'm sorry, Frank. He's like, no, it's all good. Let's get in the car. And then once they get in the car, when no one else can see them, he beats the shit out of them.
Yeah. I love that. I love that
sequence. But it's just one of those where it's like, he always knows he's aware of the eyes, and just sort of like with that with the audience is aware of that, and he's like, oh yeah, he is the good guy of this, until the end when you realize, oh yeah, all the stuff that he has done is terrible, and we should not be rooting for him. I mean, by that point he snitches, and so it's kind of too late, so you're left with this little murky feeling like, I liked him until I didn't, and it wasn't because of the crimes he committed. I don't like him now because of the act that he did within the realm of gangster films.
In his defense, though, I mean, he did snitch on crooked cops and needed to go down.
That's where I always stand. I'm like, he didn't drop a dime, although he would have. He didn't drop a dime on the Italians. He was more so like, let's get all the cops. Like, let's clear up all the cops.
Yeah, clear that.
Yeah.
Also, he is responsible for a lot of his family members going to jail. Mm-hmm. But the thing that, this is what I wish they focused on more, is they did it in one of the Thanksgiving scenes. Is pretty much why I watch this movie every Thanksgiving, is because a lot of the scenes take place in Thanksgiving, and also the movie came out in November, and I vividly remember seeing it in a sold out crowd opening night. I really wish they had shown more of his victims. They did it in that montage where they show the people who are taking the blue magic, and whether they're shooting into their foot and their veins, whatever, and they're overdosing. Some of them have babies with them.
Yeah.
I really wish they showed more of that, because it really it demonizes him in a way that I think is necessary.
I agree. I think this movie opening with him setting someone on fire was smart, but we don't have enough of those moments, because oddly enough, the Tango situation, because Tango had been such an antagonist to him by that point, that the audience was like, yeah, shoot him in broad daylight. Who cares? We don't care about Tango. So that didn't come off as demonic mode, but you needed more moments where you're right, where you do this to somebody who is not as quote unquote deserving of that. And I think it would have played better to sort of make him give this undercurrent of being dirty, because all the things that he did, and this is sort of just how that character was. Same with Bumpy. He was sort of referred to as the Robin Hood. And when you do that, you didn't make a character that the audience is sympathetic to, although we probably should not be.
Yeah, and I think the line of thinking at the time, what they were saying was that, an audience is not going to show up to watch a movie for almost 3 hours to watch an evil man do evil things, or certainly an unlikable character. And I was thinking, they might have a point, but if you look at some of Scorsese's movies, for example, if you look at Raging Bull, or if you look at Taxi Driver or The Wolf of Wall Street, he does a very good job of making you watch completely unsympathetic characters and monsters, but he does it in such a way where he makes the characters fascinating enough where even though you don't like them, you still are watching them compulsively because of their behavior, and you want to see what they're going to do next. I think Ridley Scott and Steve Zalian could have taken that approach with Frank Lucas instead of kind of making him an anti-hero of sorts. But that said, I wanted to talk about it because it is my only flaw with this movie is that they did that. And I think it would have been an even stronger movie had they made him kind of like a Michael Corleone in Godfather Part 2, where this man has no soul. Mm-hmm. And yes, he throws turkeys out to the public on Thanksgiving like Bumpy did. And, he gives back to his community. But you know what? He's making his community worse, and he's killing a lot of innocent people. He's thriving off the junkies. Not to mention, he's smuggling heroin in the caskets of fallen soldiers from Vietnam. This is not someone that we should be idolizing or rooting for. But at the same time, Denzel's charisma is at such a peak that you cannot not root for him in this movie. You, at times, just like Robert De Niro in Heat, you want to see him get away with it. Somehow, some way, you want him, even though it kills you that he's doing this. It's like, damn it, you are so likable, and yet you're a piece of shit.
I remember that final sequence when they catch T.I. coming out, and they basically are following him to the drug house, and he's going to church with his mom and his wife, and he comes out, and I'm just like, and he's looking around the surroundings. I'm like, please find a way out. Like, as an audience member, I'm like, please find, I need you to not be in this situation, because I want this to continue, because I am enthralled with everything that's going on right now.
Yeah. But, to Zalian's credit, he made every other character in the movie, except for maybe the mom character, and except for his wife, he made everybody very three-dimensional and very complicated. For example, we're talking about Richie Roberts, who Russell Crowe plays very well. He's not your standard hero cop in the movie. Yeah, he's a good cop. He doesn't take dirty money. He doesn't take bribes. But at the same, he's an adulterer. He's an absent father for his son. Yeah. He's got his own issues, like you said. He's got his own demons.
He's got his own. One of my favorite scenes in this is the courtroom scene with he and Carla Gugino, I believe. Yeah. Pronounced. It is amazing because he's like saying, I'm sorry, but don't take my son away from me. And she just reads him the riot act. Like, you might think you're this golden boy and you're so great because you didn't steal the money. And that's what you get away with in police work. But that makes you feel better. You get this coda to be like, I'm good here. That means I can be filthy in my life. I can be filthy to you as a husband, as a wife, be filthy to my father, to my son. I am a terrible human being, but I didn't take that money. So I am all good. And it's in that moment that he sort of has this oh, crap.
It sinks in.
You're not wrong. My bad, Judge. Just ignore all this. I'm sorry I wasted your time. I'm gonna roll out.
It is a great scene because it's also in that moment where I think he realizes that just to plow ahead with the mission, just to kind of get it done and to arrest Frank and kind of bring the whole thing down. Because from that point on, he's a very distracted character. But that is a great scene. It's what you don't see scenes like that in movies too often, like especially in courtroom dramas where the person just gets up and it's like, yeah, you know what, you're right, I am a piece of shit. Sorry, but a great performance, a very understated performance in comparison to Denzel's kind of bravura.
Yeah.
So it's a nice yin and yang kind of thing going on between the two of them. And then also you have Josh Brolin in a great role as Trupo, very unlikable. Has some of the best scenes in the movie with Denzel as far as I'm concerned. You got Ted Levine, and then let's talk about this real quick before we go on to the aesthetic of the movie and favorite scenes and stuff like that. But the presence of T.I., the presence of Common, the presence of the RZA. I think
got a lot of hip hop.
But it was a genius move because it's kind of like an homage to Scarface in that way, because the hip hop community had when Scarface came out in '83, apparently it just got buried. Everybody hated it. It's disgusting. It's trash, man. It's a masterpiece. But the hip hop community brought it back.
And adopted it as a film for themselves, yeah.
And because of that renaissance in the hip hop community, that's why Scarface got the second life that it did have. And you have people naming their acts after Scarface. You have people having songs named after Scarface. So that gangster culture was kind of it was inspired by the movie. Mm-hmm. And now, inspired the music. Now the music is in turn coming into a movie that actually has a lot of parallels with Scarface in some ways. I just thought it was a nice touch to bring those guys in, because I remember vividly around that time, maybe a couple of years earlier, watching documentaries about, the RZA, the GZA, Jay-Z, even Biggie, even talking about Scarface and talking about the gangster film. And I remember thinking, I was like, my God, it would be awesome if one day, maybe not all of these guys, but maybe one or two or some of them could be in a gangster movie that would be on that kind of similar playing field that we talked about Scarface. And again, I don't know if American Gangster is just as good, but I thought it was a great touch by Ridley Scott to cast those guys so they could be in this movie.
I think that's what got Jay-Z to do the secondary soundtrack for this album. It's like they are all sort of ingrained in that gangster sort of world. And he was like, once he was in it, I think he was only supposed to do one song, and he was like, nope, I'm doing an entire album. F it. And I'm in this.
As it goes, apparently is that when they were putting together the first trailer that played in front of Born Ultimatum, they used Heart of the City from the Blueprint. Mm-hmm. And I guess he was so moved by a rough cut of the movie that's when he decided he was going to do the entire album. So, just an absolutely loaded cast. Carla Gugino, like you mentioned, Ted Levine.
Armand Asante. I was like, what is
Armand Asante? I just added
insane.
Just out of the blue.
Yeah.
You got John Hawkes, right? John Hawkes.
Cuba Gooding is in there.
Yeah, that's right. Cuba Gooding.
Barnes, yeah.
I feel like we're missing someone that, for whatever reason, I'm blanking on right now. Whatever, it doesn't matter. But anyway, Ruby Dee. Ruby Dee got a Best Supporting Actress nomination out of this.
Mama.
So, yeah, it's a great cast, but ultimately it's Denzel's show. I want to segue a little bit into the aesthetic of the movie, which is, this is actually something I find fascinating, because Ridley Scott is one of those directors who is he went to art school and he specialized in painting and doing these sketches and whatnot. And when he went into becoming a filmmaker, he said that the biggest concern for him was just making sure the image at the very least looked gorgeous, no matter what shot it was. This movie is interesting because I for a long time, I just had the Blu-ray. Mm-hmm. The Blu-ray looked like shit. It was bland. It was like washed out. It had no color, no pop, nothing. It was terrible. And then a couple of years ago, Universal put out this outstanding 4K Blu-ray of it that they went back and they remastered for 4K, and they restored every frame. Oh my God. I mean, the grain and the complexity in the colors and the saturation in the image is absolutely unbelievable. And it's to the point where it's like, it's not pretty, but your eyes still can't look away. And I think Ridley Scott said when he was shooting it that his main inspiration for the look of the movie was The French Connection that Friedkin shot in 1971. Wanted to be very cinema verite, very down and dirty, very gritty, but wanted to have a distinct style to it as well. So let me ask you about this. In terms of Ridley Scott's filmography, in terms of some of his best works, where does this rank for you in terms of the Ridley Scott, pantheon of movies? Is it a top 5, top 10? Where does it rank for you?
I have to throw The Last Duel in there now. It's top 5. It's top 5. Yeah, this is one of those ones for Ridley that I pop back in. Like, I go back to this pretty regularly to watch. And I can't say that with all of his films. Even the ones that I still hold up with some higher esteem. It's sometimes hard to go back. Some of them I'm like, I don't really want to rewatch them. But this is a quality film, because I think both film from a direction standpoint and character-wise, it's one of the better on both ends of that spectrum, and it just comes together. Plus, I have to be honest, having a cast that is primarily African American is another reason why this is pretty high up on that ranking for me, because it just, I have people that I can kind of recognize or look to in that.
Sure. No, I would agree, because, and specifically because of what you just said, because the rewatch value is it's really surprising, because Blade Runner is my 5th favorite movie of all time. I know that some people can't stand it. I know that some people fall asleep during it. For me, I could watch that movie over and over and over and over again, and I will never get bored of it, because I usually end up finding things within the frame that I didn't notice the first time. Mm-hmm. He has one thing about Ridley Scott that's amazing, not just his cinematography, not just his framing. It's what he puts in the frame. It's the art direction.
He layers his frames. I always say, like, the 3 levels of a frame. He puts something that you should be paying attention to in all of them, and he does it on purpose. Like, there's something there, and there's a reason why it's there.
As a matter of fact, he makes an unintentional cameo in the movie when they're raiding Frank's house. There's a close-up shot of the TV where they're talking about the chaos going in Vietnam, and right before it cuts to Russell Crowe kind of touching the American flag that's on one of the caskets of the soldiers. If you look in the, I believe it's the right-hand corner of the TV screen, you can see Ridley Scott sitting on the couch taking notes. I don't know how I noticed that, but no, the rewatch value on this thing is just absolutely through the roof. It's interesting because it's not an exciting movie in the, kind of like superhero term. Like
there isn't, like, Gangs of New York actually has action beat moments. But this one is pretty much I won't say one note, but there's an even level of tension that kind of goes throughout the rest of it, but there's no high or lows as far as action. But the acting is so just intense and so fantastic that there's never a dull moment for me in this entire film. And it's a pretty lengthy film, but there's no moment that I'm kind of checking out. I am always invested into this movie.
I have to agree. It's an old school, old fashioned kind of thrill machine, and it wows you with its craft and with its acting, not necessarily with the spectacle.
Right.
It's also a pretty good job. It does outside of a couple things. Like I noticed on a rewatch not too long ago and it astounds me for someone who's a perfectionist like Ridley Scott to not see this, or for anybody in his crew not to see this, is just like, what? But in one of those scenes, he does like kind of like a zoom in where Frank's kind of getting out of a phone booth and walks to go somewhere else. And in the background on a brick wall is like an advertisement for a website. If you're not looking for it, you won't see it. But I've seen the movie so many damn times that I did notice. I was like, how did no one notice that?
How did no one catch that?
Kills me, man. Because like, I'm so into the world you've created. I feel teleported back into the 70s. And then I see that, it's like, ah. Yeah. So I hate when that happens because, for all those people not to know, it's like, oh, hey, there's a computer advertisement in the background. We should probably do something about that. But otherwise, it's just a beautifully composed movie, beautifully shot. And it does rank up there for me in, I would say, not only is it a top 5 favorite Ridley Scott movie of mine, but it's also one of his most entertaining. Mm-hmm. And certainly one with the most rewatch value. I would, not in terms of quality, but in terms of the rewatch value, I would put it up there with Alien. I would put it up there with Black Hawk Down. Black Hawk Down, as far as I'm concerned, that might be, from a directing standpoint, that might be his best movie.
His best work, yeah.
It's just like that. Even Saving Private Ryan. I mean, like if you look at Black Hawk Down, it's like, oh my god, like that is so brilliantly filmed. Talk about a perfect blend of style and realism. It's just wow. Anyway, let's talk about some scenes of this movie, because our favorite scenes in this movie, rather, because like we just said, or like you just said, it's kind of like a steady rise of tension. But in that steady rise of tension, there's a lot of set pieces within it that are, it's kind of, how would I describe it? It's almost kind of like a heartbeat in a way. Mm-hmm. Everything's kind of say, and like just little moments of tension where it explodes.
Yeah, this movie is interesting to me in that some of the best moments for me are when new characters interact with characters they had not interacted with before. That's when I always kind of like, oh, that's cool. Because and like the way this world is set up is that they are always aware of each other. Like Frank is very much aware of Nicky Barnes, but we don't get that scene of them one-on-one until pretty much halfway into the movie. And you're like, that's what I wanted to see. And that's sort of what this movie does. It kind of gives you these mismatches of characters to characters, and it saves the main one with the meat that everybody's probably there for. It's the poster for everything. It's Russell and Denzel. You don't get that till the very end of the film, which is, I think that's sort of also the hook to this movie. So sort of like the Heat thing, where you don't get Al and Rob together until basically the tail end of the movie. You don't get Denzel and Russell together until the very end of this film.
Very end of it, yeah. Very end of it. For me personally, I mean, there's a bunch of different modes. I mean, obviously the raid on the projects when they kind of shut down his operation, that's a great action sequence that hits you pretty hard. But for me, one of the scenes that always jumps out to me, and I don't know why, and again, there's plenty of scenes that jump out to me, but this one specifically, where you're talking about tension and you're talking about kind of like being put into the character's shoes, is when Russell Crowe and his partner hand in the $1 million in cash, and they're counting it in front of the whole department. And some of the
whole department and the glass windows.
And the glass windows are looking right in and seeing what they're doing. And you can kind of feel the hatred and the intensity from their eyes. And they have to kind of like close the blinders or the drapes, whatever. And as he gets up and he leaves, he's like kind of putting on his coat, and he hears someone make some kind of remark behind him, like kind of like, fucking Boy Scout, I think he says. And he And he kind of turns around and looks at him. He doesn't know who says it. And he kind of turns around and leaves. And as he's leaving, it's almost like you can kind of feel like him kind of thinking like, I know what I did was right, but I just made a huge mistake. Like, that's when he realizes the danger of what he did.
What I really noticed about that shot, and I didn't notice this about the fourth time that I watched it, is that as he's leaving, because you're in a police precinct, all the criminals are not paying attention. They're like, he's fine. Like, he's a cop. He's one of them. They're not. All the cops in there look at him with the most evilest eye that they ever could humanly possible. That's just fascinating to me. Like, the cops are looking at this guy who did the right thing with like complete disdain, and the criminals are like, "That's a cop. I'm gonna go about my business." And I was like, "Oh, that's a good play on that world of how he effed up."
It's a little
how that keeps getting better goes along, because people kind of just like, if you had to redo, especially the scene at the end when Frank's like, hey, you do it differently, right? You got child support, you got all this. I was like, oh, that's a cool way to sort of always have that being a part of his story. And everybody sort of knows it. Like, I've done some work on you, and I know this is a part of your jacket. One of my favorite scenes, it's a lot of his scenes with his family is where I love. Frank with his brother Huey, when Huey is wearing one of those suits at the party, and he pulls him to the side. Says, what the hell are you wearing? And he kind of goes into him, and it's this weird moment where I don't know if Frank's being serious, but he might be. He's like, if you weren't my brother, I would shoot you. I would shoot you in the head right now. And he says it so charismatically. His brother's like, ha ha ha, you laughing? I'm like, I don't know if Frank isn't serious right now. I think he may have shot you were you not his family.
And that is a great scene too, because Denzel and Chiwetel do a good job, because Chiwetel looks legitimately unnerved when it's like, hey, Nikki's looking for it. Oh, Nikki's looking. So you're talking to me about Nikki? Like, what is it about? You talking? You want to be like
my name up with Nikki?
I don't know, man. I told him to tell you. And he has like this like confused look in his face, like, no, man, if you were my brother, I'd tell you. That's a great beat between the two of them. Just one more Russell Crowe scene, because I got another Denzel scene that I'd love to talk about. But just in terms of, you mentioned it, and it kind of triggered it for me, how you said that the $1 million kind of always is lurking on his shoulders, above his head, like around everybody that knows him. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of two scenes, but because it gets brought up both times. Remember when he's forming the team, and the RZA goes, hey, I heard a story about you that you found $1 million in unmarked cash in a cabin. You just kind of gave that up? Yeah, I did. Does anybody have a problem with that? They all raise their hands. You know what, man? So do I think about it. I should
be on a beach somewhere. Like, what am I doing?
Yeah. I love that. That's great. Because you know what? The fact that these guys are all incorruptible, or supposedly incorruptible, and he says, does anybody have a problem? And all of them raise their hand.
Oh, like, we would have thought about that one. Come on now.
And like, remember, he's been defensive about it all movie. And then to finally see him kind of like bring, like, yeah, you know
that
what?
Was the first time that the guard I sort of laughed about it. Like, because you don't really have levity moments on Frank's side, just being with his family, but you never really get it with Richie. And that's the first time in that entire movie where you kind of have a moment like, oh, he's a human. Like, that guard sort of came down a little bit, and he kind of was like, yeah, you guys are right.
No, and actually another scene that kind of ties into it is, and it's actually kind of like the light bulb moment, is when he's going to see his high school buddy that he plays baseball with, who happens to be in the mafia, is one of his informants. And he's sitting down there, and he shows him the microwave. Hey, you want one of those? I can get you one just like that. No, I'm okay, thank you. And then he shows him the picture of the house in Aspen. He's like, oh my God, it's just unbelievable. You know, all these movie stars buying stuff. It's your place. And then he said, what? Why would you do this? Why would you risk our friendship? You know what happens? Well, because I care what happens to you, blah, blah, blah. You know, there must be something we can do about leaving the big guy alone. Leave Frank Lucas alone. Before that moment, he didn't think he was after Frank Lucas.
Correct. That was the moment, because he had seen Frank, and it had dawned on him, and a couple of times people were like, why is this black dude sitting in the front row of this Muhammad Ali fight? Like,
I had Dominic Catano.
Right. Like, that seems weird, but okay. But it wasn't until that moment that he's like, oh, I thought we were looking for a bigger fish, but this might be the way that we're supposed to go.
Yeah, this is the guy that we're supposed to get. He was going after the Italian guys.
Right.
And then when he heard Frank Lucas, he's like, Frank Lucas is the guy you're scared of me touching?
Yeah.
And then if you remember, he goes back to the board and he takes the picture of him in the chinchilla.
Right
at the top.
To the top. Yeah.
And it's because of his incorruptibility that he was able to get that information.
Yeah.
Which is why I love it. It's the fact that he said, no, I'm not taking your house. I'm not taking your microwave. Right. And then eventually, inadvertently, he gets the name of the guy that he's going after. Mm-hmm. And it's an underrated scene in the movie, actually.
It is, because he definitely would have been on the take had he taken that house. Another one, as we talked about Ruby, I love the mom and Frank sequence when Frank's about to do some stupid stuff. When Frank is basically should have stopped at that point. There have been many people in this film who were like, hey, if you're quitting while you're ahead, doesn't necessarily mean it's the same as quitting.
Sure.
And his mom was kind of like, hey, look, your brothers came here for you. Your brothers, if you were a farmer, they'd be a farmer. If you were this, they'd do this. They will follow you through the sun, and I would too. I never asked you about how you got your money. I don't care. Don't want to have that conversation. And she's not stupid. She knows how this all came about. But she's saying, in this moment, stop being dumb. Let's go. Like, take your wife and go away. Like, you don't have a point to prove. You don't need to be doing this. She's going to leave you if you F all of this up. And the wife is standing there like, yeah, I probably would. And it's one of those scenes that is so powerful. And he keeps talking back. He keeps being that like son, like, oh no, I got this. I'm gonna handle this. And then she smacks the shit out of him. And I'm like,
don't lie to me.
Yeah. And I was like, there you go, Ruby. That's one of those scenes where I'm like, yeah. While you are the quote unquote breadwinner for this entire family, especially in Black households, you have to know that when Mama wants you to know that she is still Mama, she will actively let you know that. And that was the moment where that happened for Frank.
It's a very endearing moment for her character too, in the sense that, you know, throughout the movie when she's introduced, you get the feeling that she is turning a blind eye, that she probably does have a feeling that whatever he's doing is illegal.
It's not on the up and up, yeah.
And in that moment, I love it because it's almost kind of like her illusions, her self-made illusions about her son and what the family's doing is crumbling down, because you can kind of hear it in her voice. I never asked where all this came from because I didn't want to hear you lie to me. So she's not stupid, but she also doesn't want to admit to herself.
If it's not in my face, then I don't have to deal. It's a very old school. I know a lot of people of that generation who think of that way. It's like, if I don't see it in front of me, then it does not involve me. I am not around it. I will take the benefits of it, but I don't have to know the day-to-day of what's going on.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Right.
But it is a great moment from her, and it's a great. I think it's a very sobering moment for the character too, because he finally shuts up after she smacks him. And you know, speaking of Denzel, I mean, I've always said this. I think I said this in my Man on Fire video. Very few actors are able to convey rage like Denzel Washington can. Very few, and I'm not just talking about like from an emotional standpoint as an actor. I'm talking about the physicality of rage, where you can manifest it. You can see it in your eyes. You can see it in your mouth. You can see it in your.
He can be completely silent, and you can understand and feel all the rage that he has.
It's rare. There's very few actors out there who can, I would put Mel Gibson as one of them. Mel Gibson's great at rage, but other than that, it's those two guys who are at just conveying this manic rage. Denzel's got some of his best rage moments in this movie, where you do feel the intimidation factor. You mentioned one earlier when Huey, right? Huey's in the car. Well, let me hold on. Okay, let me tell a brief story real quick. So I just watched it recently, Thanksgiving with my dad, and they have the montage going on with Thanksgiving, and Trupo's Shelby Mustang blows up. They're going down the alley, and then Trupo's guys pull up, and Frank's sitting there. He's like, all right, well, maybe we'll just pay him off, whatever.
He thinks it's fine. Like, this would be no big deal.
Yeah. Some of the stuff's in the front, the car frame. What? Some of the stuff's in the car. Puts down the window. Good afternoon, officer. How was your Thanksgiving? Not so good, as a matter of fact. My dad starts laughing. He gets out of the car, and I started laughing because it's something I would do. But he gets out of the car. Where's Shelby at?
Right, being a dick, rubbing in his face.
Shelby's gone, Frank. Shelby's gone. What? That is. I love that moment. And then when he gets back in, and then like out of nowhere, like I said, just blasts the hell out of him into the car window. But the scene where one of his cousins, one of the, I guess the dopier cousins, that coked out cop is at the party.
Oh, yeah.
Where he's trying to introduce his nephew to the manager, one of the guys from the Yankees.
Right.
And he's, the doped up cop is like, doing some lines on the piano, and then he starts, fondling
his girl.
His girlfriend. Yeah. And then takes out the gun, shoots him in the leg. I did that, man. I just shot him in the legs. And Denzel's like all embarrassed. He's like, oh, what? In front of the Yankee, you're done. Grabs him, puts his head inside the piano, and just starts cranking.
That anger goes from zero, and he does it so he puts his drink down so calmly. You're like, oh, this is going to. Oh wait, no, this has turned terrible.
It's one of the best beatdowns you'll ever see in movie history. Like it's up there with like the cornfield scene in Casino.
It's
like,
it's only topped by the follow-up to that, which I think is one of the most remarkable and memorable lines to this. Like, hey, don't rub that. You blocked that shit. That's 2,500 alpaca. Like, his response to you blocked that shit. Simple Simon motherfuckers. I was like, this is amazing.
And the best is when he has his final freak out where he takes and take the damn sunglasses. Take the goddamn sunglasses. And he puts it in the melted ice bucket and hits the ice bucket.
The glass.
And the butler grabs the ice bucket as it's rolling away and then stands it up like properly. It's a great, and it's things like that where you can, like you said, the calm, seething nature of the character for a character that keeps his composure throughout the movie like without letting anyone know how he's feeling, how he's thinking. But the moments where he does explode,
they're so palpable and frightening. It's like that sequence with his brother. He's in complete control that entire time, but that actually makes it scarier because he threatens Tupo in the back. He was just like, maybe next time it'll be your house.
Yeah,
like you don't have the upper hand here, but you are still talking as if you do. Okay.
Yeah. No, I love. No, I got a better idea. Or would you rather me and my partner throw you and your brother in the fucking river? Or would you rather your house blows up next time? Interactions like that. Again, seething intensity, but he's not freaking. He's keeping his shit together. He's not panicking. Mm-hmm. But I mean, this movie is loaded with so many wonderful scenes. And also, I forgot to mention this earlier, but in terms of the visual aspect of it, I forgot to mention Harris Savides shot the movie for Ridley Scott, and he actually shot Zodiac for Fincher previous to shooting this. Zodiac was shot digitally. This was shot on film. I just think it's very interesting how, and he also shot The Game for David Fincher, by the way. But I just think it's very interesting how he went on from one crime film to the other, and yet the two different mediums, digital and film. Mm-hmm. And this one's obviously got a grit and a grain to it, and a much more like, seedy kind of like the early 70s New York aesthetic to it. I just thought Harris Savides did a great job, and I wanted to mention that. Yeah. So we talked about some of our favorite scenes, performances. Now I kind of want to end the video talking about this. We're talking about Ridley Scott. We're talking about Antoine Fuqua. I mentioned some of the other directors. We mentioned how this is a top 5 Ridley Scott movie for us in terms of rewatchability. Was he the best man for the job? Who would you have, if you had the ultimate choice to direct this movie, who would it have been? And it doesn't matter if they weren't directing movies back then. To this day, if you had one choice to direct the movie back then, with same cast, same, composer, cinematographer, whatever, who would you choose to direct this movie, if not for Ridley Scott? Because I'm not sure that there's a reason I'm asking this question, but I want to let you go ahead.
It's always interesting to me because I think it's possible. We sort of talked about this with Color Purple, and it's sort of the same here. I don't always know if when a film has a predominantly, or the story is about an African-American, if it's the best for the director to not be of that same ilk. Specifically, we're talking about a person of Black. I think Ridley Scott did an amazing job. There are some things that texture-wise and just concepts of just the Black aesthetic and community you just don't get that others would. And I think somebody who just intensifies that is Ryan Coogler. I think Ryan Coogler gets it. Like you feel all of Philadelphia and Creed. Like you feel that.
You're not wrong.
And I think there's some aspects of just the Black community that I think this movie, it's close. I mean, I'm not crapping on this film, but I think to take that up a notch, there are things about the Black community that I think would have been invested even more. And I think Ryan Coogler probably would have hinted more at the thing that we talked about earlier of the destruction of the Black community. You would have had that stand out a little bit more. Like you would have seen him be demonized a little bit more because he would have taken like these normal families that are actively being destroyed by this drug seeping through that community. I think he would have handled that in a better way. Whereas some of the cop stuff may have got pulled back a little bit for that, but I just think that overall, now granted, it may not have been as much of a yin and yang between Richie and them, but I think in a Ryan hand, we would have gotten more of the black side of all of this and kind of gotten into the seediness of Frank. And he may not have come out as clean as I think he did in this version.
So I agree with you. I know Ryan Coogler's not like a big name yet. For those of you who don't know, I mean, he directed Black Panther, he did Creed, and he did Fruitvale Station. So I think I agree with you, especially when you look at the aesthetic of Fruitvale Station and Creed. You see that you got the flash and pizzazz of Black Panther, and that's going to come along with a
Marvel film. Yeah,
it's going to come along with it. It's very shiny. It's Hollywood. But when you look at his more independent, I think Creed was a studio film, but like
it's a bare bone. It's really shot.
Barely. Yeah. It's an indie movie in spirit, and he carries that spirit through. So I actually agree with you. The reason why I was asking this is because, people were saying like, Ridley Scott's an Englishman. What the hell could he possibly know about New York? And what could he know about Black culture? What did he bring to it? At the end of the day, like you said, I think the movie turned out fantastic. I think it's one of the best movies. Rewatchability. We've all said this. I can't remember where I read this, but something along the fact that, Spike Lee was upset that he didn't get the chance to direct it. I don't think Spike would have been right for this movie.
I don't either. Because his name popped in my head, but Spike can get a little heavy-handed sometimes.
I think that's right. And someone even mentioned, it's like, you know what? If people are worried or complaining rather that Ridley Scott and Steve Zalian made Frank too likable in this movie, Spike would have figured out a way to make him forget about the anti-hero. He would have made him the hero.
He would have been the hero in that. Like it would have been. Black Klansman was not a good example because that character was sort of the hero, but they would have found a way to make that Robin Hood the best thing possible and make the cops seem like the worst thing ever. Like it would have turned where this film becomes almost like a blaxploitation film, which I don't think is the point of this flick.
No, it's not. And who knows? Maybe that wouldn't have been the case, but. Funny enough, last night for the first time I watched Summer of Sam. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
I have.
So, if you think about it, if you want a black director to make this, Spike would have been, on the surface of it, would have been perfect because he was 15 or 16 when this was going on, and he was living in
New York
City.
Yeah.
So he was familiar with this. And he talks about all the time how he can remember stuff from 15, 16, 10, 8. He can remember everything. So if you think about it, he would have been the perfect director. But I was thinking, you know what? No, I can't. He would have, if you've got Denzel, you've got the script. Do not change anything. Just film it as is. I think he would have knocked it out of the park.
I do too.
And I just thought that was kind of unfair for someone to say like, oh, well, Ridley Scott shouldn't get the job because, this is the only guy who should be doing it. It's like, you shouldn't say this is the only guy who should be doing it because there's a bunch of different filmmakers who could take that same script and probably knock it out of the park. The one guy, and I want to preface this too, we're assuming that the director who handles this is going to be at the peak of their abilities when they do it. I would have loved to have seen Michael Mann direct this.
Literally on my I was like, Michael Mann is the guy that I would have put next as my guy to do this. Because
we're assuming that he's operating at the peak of his abilities.
Like if he's in that collateral heat range, chef's kiss, let's do it.
My God. Can you imagine the music choices he would have? And the way he would have filmed New York. Oh my God.
Oh, New York. Again, that's why I watch Collateral probably every 3 months and LA is a fucking character in this thing.
But anyway, I could talk about this movie all day. I think, and ultimately, I think we've done a pretty good job of explaining why it deserves more credit than it does. Because, again, killer cast. You got a director working at the height of his game. Beautiful New York locations. Great locations in Thailand, by the way. And just a side note of trivia, the heroin plantation, I guess you could say, where he goes to Thailand and he talks to the guys about getting the raw heroin and then delivered into the planes to get back to New York. That was apparently the actual place where Frank Lucas went to go get his heroin in real life.
Oh, wow.
And some of the villagers that were extras, they actually were there when Frank was cultivating the heroin and taking it back.
Wow, that's pretty.
So I thought that was actually a very interesting thing. It's just like, oh my God, because the movie was made like 34 years after he went to jail, and 34 years later, you guys you're still there doing the same. I don't know if I'm still doing the same thing with heroin, but it's the people who were doing it at the time are still there. It's
pretty awesome.
It is pretty awesome. And again, a true story, a true crime film. And the key to the movie, like you stated, it may not have shootouts, it may not have car chases. Well, no, it does have a shootout, but it may not have shootouts across the board. It might not have car chases or explosions, but it's just got such quality acting and just top-notch production value, everything. It really is just a solid movie. And it deserves a lot more respect in the crime genre as a whole, I think, when you're talking about when you're talking about The Godfather, Godfather 2, Scarface. You mentioned New Jack City.
I love New Jack City, especially in the that's a high pinnacle in the Black community, like New Jack City, Wesley Snipes, that era, that gets a lot of love. But it also, I think I mentioned off mic, is that's one of those films that the character is very much, we know Wesley Snipes' character is very much the villain of that. Whereas this one, it blurs the line. And I think the snitching aspect of it kind of comes to part. But I do think that this movie should be in that. When we talk about the Heats and the Scarfaces and the Godfathers and all of those, this should be right in that same pantheon of all of those. Because it's going to be blasphemous for a little bit, but I think the rewatchability of this one compared to some of those films is actually quite a bit higher than a couple of those films, because some of those are a little bit more old in tooth or not as refined as I think this film. And I think this film has the ability to have an actor carrying, while he has a lot of help, carrying the ball throughout the entire film, where I think some of those other movies, they don't have as talented. Heat, notwithstanding, because that cast is stupid.
Yeah. Well, actually, I will agree with you that it actually has more rewatch value than some of the so-called superior movies on that. Like, I mean, okay, for example, Godfather Part 2 is one of my favorite movies of all time.
Yeah.
I can talk to you about that movie probably until next Christmas, and I still will have plenty of things to say about it. However, it's such an exhausting watch.
It's a hard watch.
It takes a lot out of you. Like you are drained by the time.
That's a movie, both of them actually, but specifically 2, that is a movie that I have to watch kind of in chapters. Like I'll watch a part of this and I'm going to walk away for a bit.
It takes a lot out of it. Yeah. It does. It takes a lot. Now, Scarface to a lesser extent. I mean, obviously I'm biased, but I mean, Scarface I can watch. I mean, I know it's 3 hours long, but I like watch just, oh my God. It's kind of, remember V for Vendetta when V showing Evie, I think it's like a Robin Hood or Captain Blood or whatever they're watching on TV with Errol Flynn.
Yes.
And at the end of it, she's like, oh, like it gets me every time. Like that's how I feel about Scarface. Like no matter how many times I watch, it's so good. I don't care that it's 3 hours long. It's just no. That is an interesting point. Is that in these other revered classics of the genre, they're known for their greatness, not necessarily their rewatchability, despite them being classics work.
Right.
So yeah, it absolutely just has that rewatch value. And I hope that in the years going forth, maybe it's reevaluated. And again, it's weird to talk about it on the underrated series because it's not underrated in terms of its quality, but it is underrated in terms of the genre that it's in the box that it's in. If you mention it in Ridley Scott's other movies, maybe people would agree with us that it's great, but just for some reason in its own genre, it's kind of like the Rodney Dangerfield of crime. It doesn't get any respect, But anyway, I think that'll do. Do you have any closing thoughts you want to say?
No, I doubt it at this point. If you're a fan of either Denzel or Ridley, you would have seen this film. But if you have not, you should treat yourself to this and pair it with a nice sampling of Jay-Z's American Gangster album, because it's arguably Jay-Z's one of my top 3 Jay-Z albums as well. So
that is a conversation for another time. You can't just say something that provocative. You can't just say that.
Just leave. Cool, and I'm out, guys. Goodbye.
You can't just drop that. Come on, man. Like now I have stuff I want to say. But I will restrain myself. All right. So where can they find you?
You can find me on YouTube. I run the Hollywood Already Did It channel, Hollywood ADI on YouTube. I do TV reviews for like shows like Bel Air and Pam and Tommy right now. We do our trailer reactions there. And we also host our podcast there with our good friend Blake Schultz.
We got a couple other movies coming down the pipeline, but hope you enjoyed our little retrospective of American Gangster. I know it's a little scattershot, but when we're passionate about things, it just gets away from us. So I'm Steve Cravens. That's Terrence Tatum. This is the Underrated Series. This has been American Gangster. We'll talk to you next time.